This is in some ways an homage. I think that you have certainly homages here to John Ford and some of the greats. You know, you're standing in the shadows of some of those great directors who have made these.
Yeah, it's always tough when you make a film in a genre like the Western or even the gangster genre, in which some of the best films ever made reside. So immediately you're going to be compared to those films. But I didn't, the film doesn't flinch from America's kind of dark and unforgivable past of attempted genocide towards our indigenous people, but it also is, I think, speaking to some of the modern concerns that we have, this very vast racial and cultural divide that seems to be getting wider by the day. So I wanted to pay homage to Ford, to some of the psychological westerns of Anthony Mann, but also make it feel very contemporary.
Now, Christian, you worked with Scott before, Out of the Furnace, and this is your second teaming with him, as it were. What was it about this character, Blocker? He's a very interesting, complex guy in this movie. What was it about that appealed to you when you saw the script?
Well, one of the things that really appealed was the pacing of it, of looking at, how people would have behaved at that time. The fact you don't go racing your horse, you're walking it, and then the violence is sudden and extreme when it does happen, and then goes again. Of this solitary nature of a man who's been out in this Fort Beringer for years and years and years, and I liked watching Ken Burns' Civil War documentary, thinking that was, how Blocker would have grown up. And I kind of sort of imagined, even though they were meant to be older, many, 12, 13, 14-year-olds were fighting in the Civil War. And so I pictured him kind of being in the Hornet's Nest at Shiloh, and that's kind of really been his entire life, has been fighting. And he's a dutiful soldier. He does exactly what he's meant to do. I know that with Scott, he tells these stories beautifully. He is, and this is an absolute total compliment, kind of an invisible director. Like, he doesn't want to put his own sort of character, stamp it onto the film. He just wants to kind of let it be seen. And I love that. And really love working with him. He gets extraordinary performances from actors because he lets them, be comfortable and come at it with their strengths. And for me, I found it really fascinating in terms of the learned hatred that Blocker had to, acquire and accrue to do what he did. The personal tragedies of his brothers in arms who he had seen murdered and often butchered brutally, as compared to the larger atrocity of the genocide. And knowing that although Blocker has had to create this fierce hatred of Yellowhawk, he knows full well, he's a smart man, he knows full well that if he was in Yellowhawk's shoes, he would behave exactly the same way. And I see it as very much an indictment of politicians, that a Blocker is doing what he has been instructed to do, and does it extraordinarily well. And then suddenly the whims of DC change, and his attitude is no longer the correct one, and suddenly he's threatened with the court-martialing and everything, and seeing these men who really have to live day-to-day life and death, and witnessing that, compared to the safety of the politicians in Washington who then instruct these men and threaten them, and just how disgusting that attitude is. And that correlates obviously very much to what is going on today, and to since 1892 and long before as well.
This role, I've seen you in so many movies and so many great roles, dances with, well, on and on and on in your career. Well, how does this one fit into that too? This particular story in what it's saying for today's audiences. What did you respond to?
Well, I think it just went a little bit further than perhaps the ones that I've done before, and that's what always is what invites me to do a part, or it's a challenge, to play someone who's actually dying, over a long period of time. What does it feel like to know that you only have a certain number of days to live, and it's not anything that I could recall from my own life to bring to the screen at that time. Nothing ever other than having watched maybe another person slowly die. But that's the only reference I had to the whole thing. And well, where I went with it was to, concentrate on the lack or loss of hope, of a future. What does one do at the end of one's life? But yeah, that was the other part of the whole experience, was that aspect of it.
Q'orianka, you have worked with Christian before in The New World, right?
And
All three
also
of them.
this fella here.
Yes, all three of you. This
Yeah.
is a big reunion here.
Yeah.
Yes, and this role meant a lot to you too. You've worked in a lot with a lot outside. You're an activist in indigenous issues and things, and so can you talk about it from that point of view for you, what it means to be in this movie and what you do in your own life as well?
When I was a little girl, it was actually always a dream of mine to do a Western. There was something so romantic and so beautiful about it, and I always longed to live back in the day when you traveled like nomads on horseback and were one with nature, and that going back to the simplicity and the basics of life. And so when I first read the script, I was just like, yay, this is one that I can, check off my bucket list of a film that I would love to be a part of. And from, I guess, the activist standpoint of view, I really feel like Hollywood is moving in the direction of being finally becoming more inclusive, and I think it's so important. And I really, really respected and appreciated Scott and Christian's advocacy for really making sure that, there were the proper representatives of the Cheyenne community on set every single day. And one thing that, really struck me, because I don't know many directors or anyone in Hollywood that would actually take the time to do something like this, pretty much every single day, Scott and everyone, the whole crew, we'd gather around in a circle, and Chief Philip would do a prayer before we would begin the day of filming. And, it just set the tone. And it was just so wonderful and very inspiring. And, I feel as filmmakers and artists, it's our responsibility to continuously break down those barriers and push forward with the films that we make, because we have this amazing platform to help amplify those voices that are seldom heard and bring to life important stories. And, I think this film was such a great step in the right direction, and I really hope that it continues to go down this road.
Tom, you came off movies like Whiplash and La La Land. What was it like, editing a Western and working with Scott here?
It was the same as La La Land. No, I went from one old extinct Hollywood genre to another extinct Hollywood genre, and I love it. Yeah, no, Scott and I worked together. I was an assistant editor on Crazy Heart, which was Scott's first film, and we got to know one another. And I feel very lucky that our stars got to align, and that I got a call from Scott to do this picture. We kind of got to get the band back together, so to speak. It's interesting. This is the first film I've edited where I've worked on, as an assistant, I've worked for many years on a lot of films that have had violence and death and mayhem. This is the first one I've really cut that's had a lot of darkness in it. And, but the first thing that Scott told me was, he said, this is not going to be your daddy's Western, is the way he put it to me. And what he meant by that was that he wanted this film to be more a psychological portrait rather than a presentational one. So in terms of the cutting, Scott really encouraged me to create a measured pace, a patient pace, with the landscapes and the vistas, and encouraged me to do these long dissolves and superimpositions. And the hope was that that would not only show you the great geographic distances that these characters traveled, but it would also touch on the emotional distance that they traveled, and it would really heighten where they started and the place of enlightenment and added empathy that they got to in their destination. So as an editor, it always starts with the characters for me. And actually, that's where it kind of ends as well. I mean, for these action scenes, whether it's a drum solo or musical number or the end of Hostiles, if you don't understand where the characters are at or what their motivations are, or you don't understand what they're going through emotionally, then you don't really have a scene, is my opinion. So, anyways, that was again more psychological and psychological first and Western second in a way.
Thank you all for coming
you so
out here, guys.